All right, so continuing forward where we left off on part one is kind of following through on what concerns dominated the discussion. We know that Thomas Hobbes and John Locke's ideas really guided, and we know that the fundamental debate was what is the nature of Republican government, what should it look like? But let's be more specific. What were they arguing about? And so the first thing that comes to mind is something that is one of the foundational documents of our course, which will guarantee to be on the AP exam, which is the topic of factions, which is really covered in Federalist Paper number 10, which is the foundational document that we need to know. And so the power of factions and what we should do about them was a huge debate topic. And essentially what a faction is just a group of people. It could be a political party, it could be an interest group, it could be a band of farmers in Massachusetts, like Daniel Shays led, that arise these groups that arise because of unequal distribution of property, and they threaten the stability of the nation. And so we saw this in Shays Rebellion, but we could also see it if groups of citizens in different states started to organize and were upset with their lot in life and were threatening the stability of the new national government as a result. And the worry for a lot of the founding fathers was that factions, people would put their allegiance to their faction as opposed to the country itself, and people would become entrenched and argue. And it sounds a lot like what we have today, honestly, with political parties and interest groups. But this was covered quite extensively by James Madison, who wrote Federalist Paper number 10, one of the most famous Federalist Papers, and it's something we're going to be reading this week, I believe, or next week. Because again, it's a foundational document. But the idea of factions covered and discussed by James Madison was that argument for the strong national government was that a strong national government could work to keep the power of factions in check, right? Because basically, if you allowed factions to grow unchecked, you could have a majority, if the faction gets big enough, that a majority could threaten the country, could threaten like people that weren't in the majority, and that minorities who were deprived of power by the majority faction would therefore seize government and seize power in order to survive. And so basically the idea was that factions were a threat to stability. James Madison details a pretty compelling and quite brilliant solution to how the new federal government of the Constitution could deal with factions, but we will save that for our close reading of Federalist Paper number 10. And so, we had these Federalists with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton on one side, and we had the Anti-Federalists who were strongly in favor of states' rights. And they were debating basically, okay, we agree that factions are a problem, but how do we limit them? And so, the argument that ended up winning, and that became a pretty critical part of um, the new Constitution, was this idea of checks and balances. Was that if we take government and we divide it up into a number of different pieces and layers, that it would be very, very difficult for any one faction to seize control over all the different branches of government. And that in the absence of them controlling everything, well, then you had a checks and balances system. So, in order for a faction to truly dominate this country, they would have to have the presidency, they would have to control Congress, they would have to control the Supreme Courts and the federal courts, and then they would also have to control individual states' governorships. And so, the division of the government into so many different pieces was heavily influenced by French philosopher Montesquieu, who first proposed this idea of separate branches of government. But it was this birth of something that's critical in the United States government and foundational of the Constitution, which is checks and balances. That each branch of the government, whether the presidency or the Congress or the Supreme Court, has the power to check the other branches. right? And so none of them can function in a dominant fashion because any of the other two branches can basically say, you've gone too far. And so this is, like I said, where checks and balances were born out of this debate on factions and how do we basically take what we saw happened in Shays' Rebellion and say, well, how do we keep that from happening in such a way that like threatens the very stability of the national government or the new United States that we just fought for? The next topic of discussion that was pretty big here was what is the purpose of government, right? Okay, so we settled the factions debate. Well, let's do checks and balances. Each branch can basically check the other ones, but now we settled that debate. Well, like now it's like, well, what is government supposed to do, right? What is the foundational tasks of government? And so essentially, I think the answer to this question is we really have to think about who these founding fathers were, these 55 delegates from all the different states. Essentially, we know that the majority of the founding fathers were like Thomas Jefferson and other and that were rich white dudes, right? They were social elites. They were landowners. And so these wealthy individuals who saw their wealth disrupted by Daniel Shays' rebellion basically were looking at it and saying, you know what the foundational role of government is? Protecting property, right? Protecting property rights. And this is where we see a heavy influence of Locke, who basically argued that people surrender some of their natural laws in order for some of the stability and protections of government. And so, Locke's a pretty loud voice in this debate on what is the purpose of government. And it makes sense that these social elites of the United States would be so concerned about creating a strong enough government that could protect individual property rights, land and wealth, and strong banking systems to make sure that your money is safe and make sure that the dollars are worth a lot and that we have a functioning economy where we can trade with other countries and that we are strong both at home and abroad to protect Canada or other countries from coming in and taking over our property. And so we needed to create a strong federal government that could protect property rights. But the question here was, if we're going to create this government that's going to protect property rights, then what do we do for these non-property landowners, right? In the original thing, the only people that could vote were property owning white men. And so the question that came out of this debate on the purpose of government was, should we give the right to vote to non-property owners? And the answer was yes. And that yes won out. And so following the creation of the national government, we started to see that you no longer needed to own property in order to vote. And so, just a couple little pictures here. We see some down on the bottom right, the Federalist Papers, which we're going to become intimately familiar with. The top right is Atlas students that I took on the college trip a couple years ago, standing in Independence Hall, which is these are the seats in the room where it happened, right? Where the United States Constitution was created. And so next, okay, so we've dealt with the issue of factions. We've dealt with the issue of the purpose of government. Now let's start to discuss issues of equality, right? And the issues of equality that come out of this were pretty clear, right? And we begin with the Declaration of Independence, the first line of which says, all men are created equal, right? And so this idea was, wait a second, what about slaves? What about poor people? What about women? And so we have these massive issues of equality that weren't just saying, like, what do we really believe about equality, but really where it really became critical here, and I want you to go ahead and answer this question in your notes, is you tell me, what was the big issue with regards to federal government when it came towards equality, right? Why does it matter how people are counted? Why does it matter how the country sees citizens? Hint, think about one of the branches of government and how I'm going to need to rephrase this question on the actual sheet because I'm not doing a very good job here. But the question is essentially getting at what is the big issue of why do we care about equality? It's not just what we believe. It actually has to do with how our government is constructed. So I'd like you to go ahead and pause, answer that question with your thoughts, and then we'll kick back or keep going here in a second. Okay, if you said that we're going to need to settle this issue of equality because how we count and view people is pretty critical to how we judge representation in the United States Congress. How many representatives or senators do each state get, right? And to do that, if we're going to base it on population totals, then how do we count? Right? How do we judge equality with regards to population totals in order to figure out the Congress? And so this issue of how we dealt with equality was a huge one, but strangely, the Constitution, outside of how we count for representation, is pretty silent on equality. And so the issue again was, how is congressional representation going to be determined? And so we had a number of different arguments being made in Independence Hall. And, these arguments on how we count people in order to determine congressional representation make a lot of sense when you consider the states themselves. New Jersey was a very small state, right? And New Jersey, as a small state, does not want congressional representation to be based on population, right? Because if population was going to be the sole judge of representation in Congress, then New Jersey was going to get screwed because they didn't have nearly as many people as New York or Virginia or Pennsylvania. And so New Jersey proposed that every state would have equal numbers of reps. And Virginia, on the other hand, says, whoa, 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 New Jersey, of course you would say that. You're little and puny, and you know that if we actually counted everyone equal and based congressional representation on numbers, that you would get screwed. And so Virginia says, but that's the way it should be, right? Bigger states should have a larger say in how our country is run. And so Virginia proposed a plan that said congressional representation was going to be based on population totals. And populous states like New York and Pennsylvania and in Virginia were going to have more seats in Congress. And so these two plans were put forth, and kind of states divided along those lines, with bigger, more populous states saying, yes, Virginia, we agree, and smaller states like Delaware and Rhode Island and Connecticut are saying, no, we think New Jersey's right. But, obviously, when we look at the Constitution today, we can see in our Constitution that they both sort of won. And so along comes Connecticut, who says, you know what, this seems like an argument that we're not going to win. What if we had a two-part Congress? What if we took the United States Congress and we split it in half, and we created something known as a bicameral legislature, bi meaning two, where we had a United States House of Representatives that would be based on population, and then we'd have a United States Senate where every state would get the same number of senators, two, right? And so the Connecticut Compromise said basically, let's have both of you win, and let's create a split where you have two. The Senate, every state would have two members or two representatives in the Senate, and the House of Representatives would be based on population. And so, this controversy today, even though that settled the debate then and created what our United States, our Congress today, it still remains, because there's very easy, based on math, to make an argument that with the Senate being two from every state, that smaller states do have greater political power. Take, for example, the state of Wyoming. Wyoming has two senators, just like California, right? Just like California. And yet Wyoming has less people in the entire state than we have in Colorado Springs alone. And so with a certain amount of math, you can figure out that every person in the state of Wyoming is getting as much representation as something like 1,200 citizens of California. And so the question that we're going to pick up on Wednesday lecture is going to be how the states dealt with the equality issue, specifically as it related to slavery, and how do we count the population of large slave owning states like Georgia and South Carolina, where slaves made up a huge